While the UN committee was preparing its report, the Jewish agency pressured the British to open Palestine's borders to Jewish immigrants. The paramilitary group Haganah chartered an old ship, naming it Exodus 1947. In July, it arrived outside Haifa with 4,500 Jewish immigrants from Central Europe. Most were survivors of the Holocaust and Nazi death camps. Rather than continue living in the displaced persons camps, they joined those immigrating illegally to Palestine. But their hopes were dashed when British naval forces boarded and searched the vessel. In the struggle, 3 passengers were killed and 100 others wounded.
There were terrible clashes throughout the journey. From Haifa, they were sent back to France and then to Hamburg.
The events brought about a turning point. Faced with international outrage, the British were incentivized to handle the issue as peacefully as possible. At the UN, the delegations prepared to vote on Palestine's future. David Ben-Gurion listened to the first results on the radio. By his side was Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of the former US president. She had lobbied for the United States to help refugees in World War II, and she'd played a key role in drafting the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. France was keeping quiet about its plans, but Léon Blum, who was very touched by Chaim Weizmann's message, promised to use his influence. US President Truman pressured the representatives of the reluctant member states to vote for partition. The Philippines and Haiti were promised loans in return.
The majority were against the partition plan, but the Americans used Thanksgiving as an excuse to postpone the vote. They then came back with the support of 2 small countries, ones you could barely point out on the world map. The Americans had swayed the countries during their national holiday, and with that, the majority shifted.
The Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Gromyko, surprised the Western world with a pro-Zionist speech.
During the last war, the Jewish people endured indescribable suffering. This explains the aspirations of the Jews to establish their own state. It would be unjust to deny them that right.
Gromyko made a speech presenting himself as a Zionist. For years, the Soviets had persecuted Zionists and threw them in gulags.
Gromyko's speech had nothing to do with what had happened. Soviet diplomats were not exactly known for being sentimental.
It all came down to their interests. The Soviet Union wanted to replace the British in the Middle East. It knew that the British were leaving and wanted to get in before the US could come.
Soviet Union, yes. United Kingdom, abstain. France, yes.
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
The majority we received at the time of the partition decision in November 1947, we never would have actually achieved. It would have been very difficult to get.
Sometimes people say this vote happened out of remorse about the Shoah. But where was this conscience before?
It's the tragic paradox of this country, that it grew out of the worst catastrophe ever to befall the Jewish people.
The UN resolution proposed dividing Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and the other Arab, with Jerusalem under international control. But most Palestinian Arabs and all neighboring Arab states rejected the plan.
Did the Palestinians make a mistake when they rejected the partition plan? Was it already a sign of fanaticism?
In retrospect, it seems the Arabs' opposition to the UN partition vote was a mistake.
In hindsight, we can say today that mistakes were made, which went wrong before 1947 too.
From their point of view, it was simply out of the question to all of a sudden live alongside a Jewish state.
All of Israel's attempts to go through with partition were thwarted by the Palestinians.
They did not see why they should give up half of their homeland. There was no understanding within society.
But would it really have played out differently? Would we really have a better situation now if the Arabs had said yes back then? Would the Israelis or the Jews really have gone along with it?
On the day of the UN decision, I was still a little girl and already in bed. My mother woke me up so that I would remember the founding of the state. The Jews were given a state.
David Ben-Gurion was on alert. He voiced his concern to Shimon Peres, who was in charge of weapons purchases. Today the people are dancing, he said, but tomorrow blood will flow. Peres thought he was exaggerating, but the prediction came true.
My father told me the day the outcome of the vote was announced that a war would now follow. Israel was born in war. People danced through the night on November the 29th. And the last who were celebrating met the first who were killed in the morning.
They said, return quickly to Tel Aviv. On the way to Ramla, there were the first dead.
The first war started in 1948 with the partition. It was a war between the Haganah and the Palestinians, the first Arab-Israeli war.
What happened was that the Palestinians did not accept the decision and instead started a war.
The Arabs carried out deadly terrorist attacks. 3 car bombs were planted in Jerusalem. One in front of the building of the newspaper The Palestine Post, another at Ben Yehuda Street Market, and a third at the offices of the Jewish Agency. In Haifa, members of Iagun, a paramilitary group that broke away from Haganah, threw 2 bombs into a group of Arab workers. 6 of them were killed. In retaliation, the angry crowd killed 39 Jews before British soldiers could restore order. In March 1948, Plan Dalet was developed, allowing Haganah to maintain order and start expelling Palestinians. Ben-Gurion planned to implement it around the time of Britain's withdrawal on May 15th. But faced with fighting on the ground, the Haganah went on the offensive and put the plan into action already in April.
The Haganah ramped up the pressure for people to leave the country. Gunfire in the night, lots of jeeps driving around, things like that, so people would panic.
There was always talk of clearing out areas in order to settle other people there. There was a very clear policy in place. We have the military operational plans of the Jewish army, which was the Haganah back then, and they were all aimed at clearing the land.
When my parents came to Jerusalem, they were both, independently from one another, offered the apartments of Palestinian refugees who had fled. I'm happy to say they both refused. They said, how can we, as refugees, live in an apartment of refugees?
There were some massacres to send the message that only if people fled would their lives be spared.
In March of 1948, there was an incident in Deir Yassin that caused panic.
Deir Yassin was a small Arab village with 600 residents, located 5 kilometers from Jerusalem. It held no strategic importance for the Haganah. But 2 offshoot Zionist paramilitary groups, Iagun and Lehi, attacked the village anyway. The operation on the morning of April 9th was poorly coordinated. The Palestinians fought back, killing 5 men. Iagun and Lehi doubled down, seizing house after house and blowing some up with explosives. Nearly 200 were killed in the massacre.
This was a new situation. They tried to use organized actions to propel people to flee, for example, by murdering people, like what happened in Deir Yassin or other villages and cities like Lod. People fled out of fear for their lives.
About Deir Yassin, everybody heard about Deir Yassin, and everybody's mind began to be that if we stay and we have these Jewish forces come, they will also massacre us as they did in Deir Yassin, so we better not stay and get massacred.
Rumors about Deir Yassin terrified people. They were sure that the Zionists would kill them. I think the Zionists didn't actually want to kill them, but they did want to push out as many people as possible.
Deir Yassin was early on, and it was used as a psychological warfare in convincing many more Arabs and frightening many more Arabs into fleeing their homes.
Dans les mémoires du premier ambassadeur des États-Unis en Israël.
Shortly after this event in Deir Yassin, the first US ambassador to Israel has a conversation with Weizmann, the pacifist,
Le pacifiste,
in which he calls the massacre senseless.
Massacre inutile, on voit pas pourquoi. Et Weizmann a cette phrase qui vous donne.
What Weizmann says is chilling. This massacre was, and I quote, a miraculous simplification of Israel's task.
Je cite, une simplification miraculeuse des tâches.
It has convinced the most stubborn among them to leave.
Ceux qui étaient récalcitrants qu'il fallait qu'ils partent.
The children learn, yes, it's a shame that people die, but it's not that important. What is important is that we will have a state.
On May 14, 1948, a jubilant crowd marched through the streets of Tel Aviv with flags bearing the Star of David. Jerusalem was surrounded and not accessible. David Ben-Gurion stood beneath a portrait of Theodor Herzl and declared, "We hereby declare the establishment of the Jewish state to be known as the State of Israel." He added, "We extend our hand in friendship and peace to all our neighboring states. There is enough room in this land for us and the Arabs." The State of Israel was born. The dream had become a reality. But the Arab Higher Committee had previously declared, "Arabs solemnly declare before God and history that they will never submit to any power coming to Palestine to enforce partition." Britain's mandate officially ended and troops returned home. The British commander-in-chief symbolically handed over command of the land to Zionist leaders.
I was so excited that I couldn't sleep for several nights. Tel Aviv without the British. The British had left Israel, but they had left many weapons to the Arabs. The British had initially been anti-Zionist. They also did not believe that Israel, which was born from blood, would withstand the Arab armies. Most of the diplomats and world leaders, and even some of the Zionist leaders here, considered it difficult, if not impossible, for this new state to withstand an attack by the Arab armies.
The armies of neighboring Arab states moved into the former British Mandate territory. The First Arab-Israeli War began. Egyptian planes bombed Tel Aviv. Almost 3 years after the liberation of Nazi concentration camps, most Jews believed they were fighting for their survival.
That was certainly a mistake. Entering a war they were not ready for.
Remember that the Arab side started the war and lost it. Could Israel have behaved better? Yes.
It was announced everywhere. If you take the coastal road to Haifa, you'll be safe. You'll be okay. You can escape.
They loaded trucks from Haifa to Tel Aviv. Nearly all the residents of the villages were expelled.
People felt endangered and didn't feel safe to stay. And they all thought, as it was the case with my parents in Jaffa, that they would leave and be safe, as people do in wars, and then after the war is over, they will be able to return, but they will never able to return.
Mon père nous avait évacués, ma mère et moi, quelques semaines plus tôt.
My father had put me and my mother on a truck a few weeks earlier. It literally dumped its load of women and children on the southern border of Lebanon.
Déversé à la frontière sud du Liban.
When the city fell, my father and sister went to the port and boarded one of the last boats to leave the city. So they ventured across the sea to their Lebanese exile.
Someone who lived through the Nakba told me there were boats standing ready in Jaffa. Were they there purely by chance? No. Those boats were there for people to flee, or they'd be expelled.
No one leaves on their own accord. No one leaves their home, their fields, their land of their own free will. In war, people are afraid and they flee. And they hope that after the war is over, they, especially the farmers, will return to their land and home.
The Arab leaders said, "Leave now and come back later. We will win. We will come back and take everything. The property, the land. We will be victorious."
In my eyes, the crime is that they were not allowed to return. People are displaced in war, but why did we shoot at them when they tried to return?
In July, a few months after the establishment of the Israeli state, which was in May, in July, at gunpoint, people were forced out of their homes.
We are talking about 750,000 Palestinians who were displaced before, during, and after 1948.
As a series of operations, interrupted again and again by ceasefires, Israeli forces win on all fronts except in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was divided by the Armistice Line, leaving the Old City on the Arab side. The Jewish population was expelled by Jordanian soldiers. The West Bank was annexed by Jordan and the Gaza Strip was occupied by Egypt.
By 1947, they bought up 10% of the Palestinian land. Only 10%. In 1948, after the war, the rest of the land was annexed, transferred to their possession.
As a result of the war in 1948, most of the 900,000 Palestinian Arabs living in the country prior to the founding of the State of Israel fled. Only 150,000 Palestinians remained, subject to Israeli military administration. The international community did little to assist the refugees.
You have to keep in mind that in 1948 there were millions of displaced people in Europe. The expulsion of 800,000 Palestinians, or natives as we said at the time, that hardly mattered.
Quel problème?
على هذه الأرض ما يستحق الحياة. رائحة الخبز في الفجر. تعويذة امرأة للرجال. غيم يقلد سربا من الكائنات. على هذه الأرض سيدة الأرض أم البدايات أم النهايات. كانت تسمى فلسطين، صارت تسمى فلسطين. فلسطين